There is something that no one says out loud, but that everyone who wakes up too early ends up discovering. Seeing what others don't see comes at a price. It's not a gift, it's a burden. And most of the time, the punishment doesn't come in the form of pain. It comes in the form of silence. It's as if the world forgets you the moment you begin to understand it. There are people who are born with an almost painful sensitivity to the invisible. They can't just observe what's happening. They feel what drives each event. They perceive the reason behind the most mundane gestures, the emotional machinery that drives desire, fear, faith, and even greed. They are the ones who see the hidden engine of the world. But the clearer the vision, the more unbearable the noise of a planet that thrives on appearance. Have you ever felt this? A sense of displacement, as if the time of those around you were different from yours? As if the whole world were shrouded in a fog that only you perceive. And the more you try to warn others, the more they call you exaggerated, pessimistic, or even crazy. Deep down, what isolates you is not the world, it is lucidity. Those who truly see what lies beneath the surface end up being pushed to the margin, as if the system were afraid of them. Because those who see too much threaten the balance of illusion. And the world, this gigantic theater, only works as long as everyone believes in the same script. That's why those who break the illusion inevitably begin to disappear. Not suddenly, but in small doses. First, the enthusiasm for empty conversations disappears. Then, the interest in easy promise. And finally, the desire to belong. Silence, which once seemed like loneliness, becomes a refuge. But what exactly do these people see that others cannot see? They realize, for example, that almost all human relationships are exchanges of energy disguised as affection. That ideologies, beliefs, and even love are often tools for maintaining control, not over the truth, but over fear. They notice that great empires are not sustained by weapons, but by narratives, and that narratives, indeed, rule the world. John D. Rockefeller, one of the most powerful men of the 20th century, once said, "Those who understand interest receive it. Those who don't understand it, pay it." But what few realize is that this phrase was not about money. It was about power. Because the real interest charged to humanity is distraction. And those who don't understand this spend their lives paying with their own time. There is an invisible elite that has never needed to hide, because it has learned to camouflage itself within the obvious. We are not talking about conspiracy theories, but something deeper. A collective psychological structure, where a few dictate the meaning of reality and the majority just react. Those who begin to understand this mechanism feel something strange, a mixture of indignation and loneliness. Indignation at seeing manipulation in every detail, and loneliness at realizing that no one seems to care. After all, it is more comfortable to believe that the world is fair than to face the abyss of realizing that everything is a game, and that almost no one knows the rules. But the truth is that there is no control room with men in suits deciding the fate of humanity. What exists is something more subtle, quieter, and infinitely more efficient, a system that feeds on fear and ignorance. And fear, as you know, is the greatest enslaver of all time. What if I told you that those who see this don't go crazy? They just become invisible. They learn not to waste energy trying to convince others. They start acting behind the scenes, observing, understanding, retreating. Not out of cowardice, but because they understand that awakening cannot be imposed. It just happens. And when it happens, there's no turning back. That is why many of these observers seem to disappear. They do not die. They just withdraw. They remain alive, but off the radar. They are the ones who choose silence not as giving up, but as resistance. It is curious. The world venerates those who make noise, but is guided by those who act in silence. The most profound revolutions never begin with shouting in the streets, but with an internal change, silent, persistent, almost imperceptible. And it is at this point that each person's story begins to merge with that of the world itself. Because those who awaken no longer seek to win, they seek to understand. And those who understand inevitably stop competing with others and begin to dialogue with their own destiny. How many times have you felt that your presence was uncomfortable simply because you were too authentic? How many times have you noticed that, when you told the truth, the atmosphere changed, that the laughter of those around you sounded mechanical, and that conversations went round in circles, as if no one really wanted to move on from the same point? There comes a moment when human beings realize that they can no longer distract themselves, and that moment is the beginning of a symbolic death. the death of naivety. From then on, something new begins to emerge, a lucidity that is frightening, but liberating. Because seeing what moves the world is also seeing the emptiness behind many certainties. And there is nothing more lonely than realizing that most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But it is precisely at this point that the beauty of consciousness emerges. The power to see without being seen, to understand without having to convince, to exist without having to prove anything. The silence of those who awaken is not absence. It is fullness. It is the sound of a heart that has learned to observe without judging, to act without showing off, to transform without destroying. And, curiously, it is from this same silence that great changes are born. Because the world is moved not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who can see what others pretend not to see. Disappearance, then, is not an end. It is a return to the essence, to the point where human beings cease to be cogs in a machine and return to being consciousness. The fate of those who see is indeed to disappear, but only in the eyes of those who still sleep. In the eyes of life, they become light. There is a moment in life when the noise of the world begins to wear you down. The news, the speeches, the promises, everything sounds the same, repeated, like an empty echo. And those who have lived long enough to see several changes of era know that, deep down, almost nothing changes. Only the disguise. The symbols change clothes, the narratives gain new words, but the essence of the game is the same: to manipulate perception. You may have already felt this in 2025, when you turn on the television and realize that each channel has its own truth, or when you open social media and notice that everyone seems happy, successful, and conscious, but inside, there is silent despair. The world has learned to sell authenticity as a product, and the more they sell it, the rarer it becomes. Older people, those who have seen time turn everything into a commodity, see through the trick. They have already witnessed promises of freedom that have turned into new forms of imprisonment. Technology promised connection, but brought loneliness. Medicine promised longevity, but forgot the soul. Religion promised salvation, but demanded submission. The curious thing is that the generation that is now between 40 and 65 years old has experienced the most profound transition in human history, the leap from the analog to the digital age. They are the ones who saw the world exchange touch for screen touch. And suddenly, they realized that reality had become a spectacle, that facts matter less than version, that truth, today, is only what engages the most. Those who lived through this shift feel something that young people still don't understand, a tiredness that is not physical, but existential. It is the tiredness of seeing the same trick repeated with new faces. Remember when banks started saying, "You are your own bank"? It seemed like a revolution, but all the system had to do was change its language for everything to remain the same. Power just changed its format, and its owner. Now it is in the hands of algorithms, invisible, silent, and obedient to those who programmed them. There are those who still believe that the world is driven by merit, but those who have lived long enough know the world is driven by interest, and interests are shaped by fear. Fear is the fuel of obedience. So when someone begins to see what really drives things, when they understand that there is a psychological mechanism behind every trend, something inside that person begins to shut down. They no longer believe so much in ready-made narratives. They no longer feel like discussing politics at the bar. They no longer get excited about the promises of leaders, gurus, or influencers. And that's when silence begins to emerge. Maybe you know someone like that. Or maybe it's you, the one who prefers to observe rather than react, who has already understood that shouting doesn't change anything, because most people only hear what confirms their beliefs. There is an old story about a man who predicted the collapse of the financial system before anyone else. He warned banks, governments, and businessmen. No one listened. They called him paranoid. A few years later, the crisis came, and everyone sought him out for advice. But he no longer spoke. He was a recluse, tending his garden, feeding his chickens. They asked him why he had gone silent. He replied, "Once you understand what moves the world, you realize that words don't move it." This response has endured for decades because it is the essence of mature lucidity. It is not giving up, it is understanding. Spiritual maturity does not come from books, it comes from frustration. It is the moment when you realize that nothing external will save you, and that the truth was never a secret kept by the powerful. It has always been hidden in simple things, in the silence of a morning, in the gaze of an animal, in the peace of an unhurried routine. Those who see learn to recognize the subtle signs, the small manipulations that govern everyday life. Notice, fear is used in everything. In medicine ads, protect yourself before it's too late. In newspapers, the world is on the brink of chaos. In churches, those who do not believe will be punished. On social media, if you don't do this now, you will lose everything. Fear sells, fear controls, and fear is the universal language of power. But when you start to look behind it, you realize that there is a common thread: the human need to feel safe. People don't seek truth, they seek relief. And that's why the system always wins. It knows how to offer relief, even if only temporary. That's why so many awakened people remain silent, because understanding this is too painful. It means realizing that the world is not made up of good and bad people, but of sleepers and awakened people, and that waking up too early, on a planet that is still asleep, is like being awake alone in a dark house. In 2025, this became even more evident. Artificial intelligence promises to solve all human problems, but few realize that the real problem was never a lack of technology. It was an excess of emptiness. People have everything in their hands, but they feel a hole that nothing can fill. It is the emptiness of meaning. How many times have you asked yourself, why, even though I have so much, do I still feel like something is missing? That question is the breaking point. It is the moment when consciousness begins to separate from the masses, and from there is no turning back. Look at couples who, after decades together, simply stop understanding each other. It's not a lack of love, it's an excess of lucidity. One of them begins to see the other not as a character, but as a human being full of fears and wounds. And when the truth appears, the enchantment dissolves. The same thing happens with the world. When you see it without makeup, the enchantment ends. But there is something that no one says. Disenchantment is the beginning of wisdom, because after everything loses its shine, what remains is what is real. Many people in their 40s to 65s are at this very point, the crossing. The children have grown up, the goals have been achieved, the frustrations have accumulated. Now comes silence, not because of giving up, but because of saturation. And it is in this silence that true awakening begins. You begin to observe people with tenderness. You know that there is no point in trying to change them. They are still at the stage where they believe that happiness is the result of achievement, when in fact it is the consequence of understanding. Rockefeller, the tycoon who built empires with oil and banks, knew this. He said that whoever controls the flow of energy, whether financial, emotional, or symbolic, controls the world. What he didn't say is that true power lies not in dominating others, but in understanding what drives them. Those who understand fear understand the market. Those who understand desire understand religion. Those who understand emptiness understand human being. And that's where the paradox arises. The more someone understands, the less they need to control, because they realize that control is an illusion. At this point in life, many realize this in practice. When you try to control an adult child, they pull away. When you try to control destiny, life laughs. When you try to control love, it escapes. Only when you let go do things flow. And that is when wisdom begins to replace force. Those who see what moves the world stop fighting it. They become like rivers. They don't push, they just flow. Perhaps that is why so many wake up after a great loss, an illness, a separation, the death of someone, because pain breaks the spell. It tears away the illusion and reveals the essential. After that, the world never seems the same. But it is not the end, it is the beginning. The beginning of a quieter, deeper life, less concerned with applause and more focused on coherence. Those who go through this awakening know that there is a discreet beauty in disappearing a little, in not posting everything, in not having to explain anything, in not having to justify yourself to anyone. Disappearing is not loneliness, it is selection. It is choosing what really deserves your presence. And, deep down, this is the greatest form of freedom, because those who understand what moves the world no longer need to be moved by it. There is a moment when human beings realize that the world they thought they understood is nothing more than a carefully constructed play, a performance where each person's role was defined before they even realized they were on stage. It is at this moment that many enter into crisis, but few realize that this crisis is the sign of the birth of a new consciousness. Have you ever wondered who really profits when people are tired, confused, and afraid? I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking about energy, attention, time. The 21st century has turned the invisible into currency. Distraction has become the modern gold, and whoever dominates the gaze dominates the world. Social media is the most sophisticated example of this. It was not created to connect people, but to turn emotions into data. And data is the new oil. It is extracted painlessly, but with consequences. The more time you spend on social media, the more the system learns what moves you. It knows what irritates you, what comforts you, what makes you feel guilty, and, above all, what makes you stay there, scrolling through the screen as if looking for something you will never find. But what are we really looking for when we stare at a screen for hours? What is missing in us that we try to fill with so much stimulation? This question is uncomfortable because it does not point outward, it points inward, and that is why few have the courage to face it. The system gives you everything except time to think. It wants you to feel free, as long as you remain distracted. Notice how, in recent decades, everything has been simplified. Love has become a match, spirituality has become manifestation, knowledge has become a one-minute summary, immediacy has become a religion, and the sacred has been replaced by the useful. And the further people stray from depth, the more they lose meaning. But what happens when someone decides to stop? When they choose not to consume, not to react, not to compete? The system collapses, not because it hates you, but because it doesn't know what to do with those who don't need it. Have you noticed that those who live in peace seem invisible? They don't go viral. They don't generate controversy. They don't make a profit. Serenity doesn't sell, because it doesn't depend on it. Perhaps that's why so many who awaken distance themselves from the noise. It's not arrogance, it's self-preservation. They don't run away from the world, they just stop feeding what has no soul. But the price of this is high. Isolation. Conversations become rare. Superficial connections lose their flavor. You start to see faces but no longer people. And that's when loneliness hits like a mirror. Because awakening is not applause, it's mourning. Have you ever felt that, even when surrounded by people, there was something inside you that no one else seemed to understand? That what moved you sounded exaggerated to others? That what seemed obvious to you seemed strange to others? Comment below if this has ever happened to you, and how many times you preferred to remain silent just so you wouldn't feel out of place. This is the mark of someone who is beginning to see what moves the world. Lucidity changes the way you see things, but it also changes your heart. And this change is not always easy. There is a little discussed psychological theory about empathy fatigue. It describes the exhaustion of those who feel too much, who absorb collective suffering without knowing how to return it to the world in the form of balance. Jung would call this the process of individuation, the point at which human beings realize that they can no longer live in the shadow of others. But how can we maintain balance in a time when noise is constant? How can we preserve our soul in a world that turns everything into performance? Paradoxically, the answer lies in what the system fears most, in retreat, in the simple act of not reacting to everything, of not responding immediately, of not explaining oneself. Because silence is not absent, it is concentrated power. Have you noticed how the people who have had the greatest impact on your life were not the ones who talked a lot, but the ones who conveyed presence? The steady gaze, the calm gesture, the silence before the response. There is something deeply revolutionary about those who do not rush. In times of superficiality, depth is subversive, and perhaps that is why those who see too much disappear, not because they vanish, but because they change frequency. The noise can no longer find them. In 2025, humanity is more informed than ever, but less aware than it has ever been. Millions know what is happening in every corner of the planet, but few know what is happening within themselves. And this is the new form of slavery. Always being in the know, but never present. How many times have you woken up and felt that your mind was already full before you even opened your eyes? News, demands, comparisons, urgencies. It's as if the day starts out owing you something. But to whom exactly do you owe something? This question is the turning point. Because those who begin to realize the depth of this manipulation understand that the real revolution is internal, and it begins when you decide to take care of your mental space as if you were protecting a sacred garden. The ancients knew this. The civilizations that survived were not the most powerful, but those that understood the value of the invisible: rhythm, time, silence. Today, we confuse haste with purpose. and those who don't run are judged as lost. But perhaps those who slow down are precisely those who have found the way. If you stopped everything for a day, turned off your cell phone, the news, the noise, what would be left of you? This simple question is one of the most feared by the system, because it reveals what no algorithm can calculate: your essence. In recent years, many have returned to seeking meaning in simplicity. People are leaving big cities, trading status for peace, success for emotional health. It is a silent but growing movement. It is not an escape, it is a return. Human beings, after losing themselves in excess, are trying to remember what makes them human. Have you ever noticed that the most valuable things in your life could never be bought? The serenity of a morning, the embrace of someone who understands your silence, the smell of coffee that reminds you of home. None of these things are on the market because they belong to the realm of the soul, and maybe that's what those who disappear are really looking for. Not a hiding place, but a place where they can be themselves without having to prove anything. Comment if you feel like you're in the process of stepping away from the noise. How many times have you thought about disappearing for a few days, not to give up, but to find yourself again? Silence is not the opposite of living. It is the right rhythm of life. And the irony is that the more people rush to get there, the further they get from themselves. Because there is no there is only here, this moment, this breath, this observing consciousness. What happens when human beings stop wanting to change the world and start changing themselves? Something extraordinary. The world changes too, but invisibly. The collective frequency rises every time an individual becomes lucid, and that's where everything falls into place. Silence, disappearance, understanding. True power has never been about dominating the world, but understanding what moves it. And those who understand this no longer need to fight. They just exist. And existing, in its most conscious form, is the most subversive act a human being can practice today. There is something curious happening right now. Millions of people are connected, but we have never been so isolated. We have never had so much access to information and, paradoxically, so little wisdom. Statistics show that by 2025, more than 70% of adults between the ages of 40 and 65 report feeling emotionally exhausted, even when their lives look fine in the eyes of others. This is no coincidence. It is a symptom of a world that has taught everyone to accumulate everything, except present. When the body ages but the soul matures, perception changes. You begin to understand that time is the most valuable currency there is. And that's when something inside you awakens, the need to live in an essential way. It's no longer about what you have, but about what inhabits you. A study by Harvard University, the longest ever conducted on human happiness, revealed something that contradicts everything modern society values. They followed the lives of hundreds of people for over 80 years and found that happiness is not linked to money, status, or professional success. The determining factor was the quality of human connections and, more profoundly, the level of coherence between what the person felt and what they experienced. In other words, it's not the number of people around you, but how true you can be to yourself within each relationship. But what happens when the whole world teaches you to be what they expect, and not what you are? Your soul begins to suffer. First, silently. A subtle discomfort when you wake up, a feeling of emptiness even when everything seems okay. Then, that feeling grows, until one day you realize that it is no longer you who is living. It is just a role you have learned to play, and that's when life begins to take its toll. However, there is something liberating about realizing this, because the moment when everything seems to collapse is exactly the point where everything can be rebuilt with truth. A striking example is that of Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived concentration camps during World War II. He lost everything: family, profession, freedom. But he found something that no one could take away: meaning. He observed that those who survived were not the strongest or the most intelligent, but those who found a why to continue. Frankl said, "Those who have a why can endure almost any how." This phrase resonates even more strongly today, at a time when many have the how, but have lost the why. Have you ever asked yourself what your why is? What moves you when everything seems to lose meaning? Perhaps you have spent your life taking care of everyone else, and now you feel a void that you cannot explain. Perhaps you have fought for security, and when you finally achieved it, you realize that peace did not come along with it. Or maybe you just feel, that there is something more, something that the modern world cannot offer. This feeling is the call of the soul, and ignoring it is like trying to silence the sound of your own heart. So it's time to turn that clarity into action. It's not enough to understand what moves the world. You have to move differently within it. Here's a simple but powerful plan to start that transformation. 1. Practice intentional silence. Set aside 10 minutes of your day for what I call soul decompression. Turn off your cell phone, put away your watch, and just breathe. At first, the silence will be uncomfortable. It's the internal noise trying to dissipate, but if you persist, the silence will begin to restore you to yourself. 2. Reorganize your emotional consumption. Ask yourself daily, what did I feed inside me today? If the answer is fear, anger, or anxiety, change your soul's diet. Read something that inspires you. Listen to music that elevates your frequency. Watch something that connects you with purpose, not distraction. 3. Restore real bonds. Find someone with whom you can be true, without a mask, without pretense. Sincerity heals what time cannot reach. Write a letter, even if you never send it. Say what's stuck in your throat. Silence heals, but truth sets you free. 4. Learn to disappear without running away. Disappearing here means consciously choosing where your energy goes. Say no without guilt. Turn off notifications. Stop explaining your choices. Your peace doesn't need to be understood, just protected. 5. Replace control with surrender. Every time something slips out of your control, instead of fighting it, observe it. Ask yourself, what is this trying to teach me? Life rarely misses the mark with the lessons it sends. And there is one last step, perhaps the most important one. Don't go back to sleep, because once you start seeing, there is no going back. And the world needs awake people, even if they choose silence as their form of presence. In a 2024 Gallup poll, 78% of people said they felt their lives lacked purpose. The most interesting finding was not the number itself, but the main reason given: a lack of connection with themselves. This confirms what many already intuit. It is not the world that has lost its way. It is we who have strayed from our essence. But there is good news. It is never too late to return. Return inward, to what is simple, to what is true. A 63-year-old woman who participated in a silent retreat in Switzerland said that after decades of trying to understand life, she finally realized something in a moment of quiet. Life doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be lived. That's the turning point. As long as we try to understand the world through logic alone, we will remain trapped in the labyrinth. But when we begin to feel, to observe, to breathe with awareness, something changes. The maze is still there, but now we know how to walk without fear of getting lost. And perhaps that is the true meaning of disappearing in silence. It is not disappearing from the world. It is disappearing from the noise that the world has created. It is ceasing to be a character and returning to being essence. Those who truly see what moves the world do not become saints or masters. They become human again, able to see beauty in the ordinary, depth in the simple, eternity in the now. Perhaps the great lesson in all this is to understand that silence is not a place of isolation, but of communion with what is real. And ironically, the more someone silences themselves, the more they begin to hear. So before I close, I want to invite you to reflect. What do you need to silence in order to hear yourself again? Write in the comments. You can be anonymous if you want. Sometimes the simple act of putting into words what is trapped inside the soul already begins the healing process. If this video touched you in any way, like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. That way, this message will reach more people who, perhaps like you, are silent on the outside but screaming on the inside. Because the world changes when a single person chooses to see and remains at peace, even when everyone around them is still asleep.